My name's Sandra Berry, and I am the director of Woodbrooke. And I'm so pleased to see everyone here. And I know there are people elsewhere in the building who are also watching and listening to the lecture. You may like to know we are live streaming this evening, and there are many friends I know around Britain and hopefully further afield who are also watching and listening live. And I welcome you all. As I said, I'm the director of Woodbrooke, and some of you may be thinking, well, that's, I don't quite know why the director of Woodbrooke is introducing the Swarthmore Lecture, because the Swarthmore Hall is in Cumbria and Woodbrooke is in Birmingham. But many of you, I know, do know why I'm introducing it, but some of you may not. And so bear with me for just a moment while I give you a little bit of background. We've heard a lot about history already this yearly meeting, and the Swarthmore Lecture began in 1908, 110 years ago, and it began under the care of Woodbrooke, and Woodbrooke continues to care and uphold and support the lecture. The topic and the name of the lecturer is discerned by a Swarthmore Lecture Committee, and that lecture committee is supported by trustees and by staff of both BYM and Woodbrooke. That process of choosing a name is rooted in our core process of nominations, of worship, and it's done a number of years in advance. So we don't always know from one year to the next which lecturer it will be, but we do know that it will be something that we hope will speak to friends. The lecture isn't written corporately. It isn't written by a committee. The lecture is very much prepared ministry. And we've heard already in some of the yearly meeting sessions references to Swarthmore lectures in the past. You may be inspired by this Swarthmore lecture. It may be that things resonate many years afterwards, and I think that is the way of any learning. And I'm often heartened by the words of John Wilhelm Rowntree, one of Woodbrooke's founders, which is, we are but seeking a rich and well-tilled soil from which every type of ministry shall spring with a robuster growth. The lecture is Woodbrooke's contribution to learning, to tilling the soil. Our Swarthmore lecturer this evening is Chris Alton, a lifelong Quaker, artist, and activist. And through his lecture this evening, Changing Ourselves, Changing the World, Chris will share how art can be an act of witness. As I've mentioned, the Swarthmore Lecture is prepared ministry, and so we don't have questions at the end. Instead, we invite you to attend the follow-up session with Chris tomorrow at 12:30 in the Sarah Fell room. It's also our practice not to applaud. At the end of the lecture, Chris will sit down, and we invite you all to hold the silence with us until the two of us shake hands. Let us now settle into worship, and Chris will speak from the silence when he is ready.
Hello. So my name is Chris Alton. My heart is going, honestly. So yes, as Sandra said, lifelong Quaker, although I've never actually formally entered into membership. And I grew up attending Quaker meetings in Croydon, then Barnstable down in North Devon, as well as a vibrant bouquet of young Quaker events. And as you can probably guess, writing a lecture that holds so much historical weight, it's not an easy task. Being the Swarthmore Lecturer is pretty scary, and it's a real honour to be standing here in front of you all today, as well as those of you watching live. And I've spent many months agonising over my ability and my inability to write a compelling lecture that's worthy of your time, that may contain a pithy quote or two that might get read out at the beginning of another lecture at some point. So, for your presence here today, I thank you. Sadly, the person who I wish could be here the most, my biggest fan, my mother, cannot. My mum, Kathy, was a Swarthmore Lecture aficionado. Over the past 2 decades, she probably attended, read, or listened to every single Swarthmore Lecture. She died a little over 2 years ago due to secondary breast cancer, and I still mourn her death. And I'm near overcome with sadness that she cannot be here today. I can only imagine her response to the news that her son would be giving the Swarthmore Lecture in 2018. It would have been delivered at a pitch only dogs can hear. And I do wonder whether she would have been able to uphold the silence. She certainly had form for being a disruptive influence, having whooped at the top of her lungs at my university graduation. So today I've chosen to mark her absence by reserving her a seat in the front row. And in the years since my mum's death, I think of her in all that I do. Her capacity for generosity and love was immense. To glimpse it was to be blessed. Today I dedicate this lecture to my mum, Kathy Alton. I love you now and always. So the theme for this lecture, changing ourselves, changing the world. That's pretty broad. The Swarthmore Lecture Committee originally came to me with a similarly vast and sprawling theme, being the Quaker you are in a changing world. However, as I began to write, it became apparent to me that what I hold most dear about this religious society of friends, that it is changing. It's not static. It's a dynamic, practical religion of life. It's formed and reformed in dialogue with our ever-changing world. Our testimonies remain more or less constant, guiding strands that run through the fabric of our faith. However, there's always room for embellishment. The addition of sustainability to the previous quartet of testimonies is a good example. And our testimonies must continue to find new expressions in our rapidly changing world, and we too must be willing to change in order to effectively answer the challenges that we face now and will soon face in the future. Octavia Butler's celebrated science fiction novel, Parable of the Sower, opens with the following. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. These words are from Earthseed, the Books of the Living, a fictional religious text crafted by the protagonist of Butler's novel, namely Lauren Olomina. The faith takes root at a time of great uncertainty and flux. Extreme inequality sees the most wealthy ensconced in fortresses of luxury, whilst the poor subsist on the most meagre supplies of food and water. So scarce are the necessities for life that violence is the norm. Under such conditions of hardship, fear, and survival of the fittest individualism, Earthseed acts as a beacon for community and kinship. We too are living through a period of particularly rapid change and uncertainty. It's not so bad as in Parable of the Sower, but the impacts of climate change are being felt globally, particularly in the global south. In late February, the Arctic experienced a heat wave so severe that temperatures were pushed 35 degrees above average. Elsewhere, numerous European countries were doused in a layer of snow, including the UK. The gap between rich and poor continues to grow. Through a cunning act of sleight of hand, also known as quantitative easing, the richest 1% have gone from having 42.5% of global wealth at the height of the 2008 financial crisis to more than 50%. Austerity continues to disproportionately impact those with the least, and our public services are steadily being privatized. The most powerful man on the planet casually threatens to ignite nuclear war on social media and continually makes vile remarks about women, people of colour, immigrants, and basically anyone else on the margins. He emboldens white supremacists, misogynists, and anyone who would enact violence against these marginalised people. In Britain, political and social divisions grow increasingly stark. I don't even want to mention the colonial nostalgia fest that we have embarked upon, otherwise known as Brexit. Many of us feel disempowered when faced with these vast challenges. It is hard not to recoil from this seemingly apocalyptic diagnosis, but we must imagine our way out. We must put all the creativity that we have at our disposal to work. We must light a beacon and we must overcome. I hope that this lecture will be one of many sources of inspiration with regard to imagining our way out of the crises that we face. I can only speak from personal experience, so forgive me if I don't solve all of the ills that blight our fair world in the next 50 minutes or so. It'll have to be a team effort, but perhaps I can share some of my tools. So I am an artist. It took me quite a while to be able to say that without the intonation of my voice suggesting that I was asking a question. So when I say that I'm an artist, I imagine that the question that maybe floats to the front of your mind is, oh, well, what do you paint? Or maybe someone's wondering whether I draw or sculpt. I will admit that I did have a brief stint as a painter during my second year of university, but let's keep that between you and me. Not good for my street cred. My first painting was of a woman surrounded by flowers. My second, 4 girls walking home in the rain. And they were nice. They were good for, hanging on the wall in your corridor or your living room. But when I was working on the third painting, as I kind of daubed and mixed, performing the sort of typified idea of the artist in his studio, creating works of profound genius, I had this moment of kind of crisis and realization. What was the nature of this crisis? Well, as I look back to this memory through the pale mists of history, of memory even, it's hard to put a finger on the exact cause. However, I do know that I was dissatisfied. As this sense of dissatisfaction kind of welled up in my chest, I did, as I'm sure many of you would have done, I very dramatically denounced painting and gave all of my paints, canvas and so on to a slightly bemused friend. So the work that I make doesn't fit into any of these formal categories: painting, drawing, sculpture. I am a conceptual artist. And conceptual art gets a bad rap. But for me, it's largely to do with making art that's led by ideas. So the work that I've made addresses a really wide array of topics, and I'm going to speak about some of it tonight. So racism, fascism, utopian ideals, British identity, British colonialism, tax avoidance. I could go on. And I make music videos, documentaries,
Photographs, music, posters, t-shirts, jackets, stickers, banners, cakes, books, a neoclassical treehouse, games, events, and I even accidentally started a protest movement once. So yeah, having kind of cut myself loose from these inherited hang-ups about what art is or what culture is, I was able to begin kind of thinking about this stuff in a far broader way. So many of the mediums that I kind of use for their capacity to be shared, to facilitate the sharing of ideas. Because, you know, what's the use of an idea if you can't share it? Another recurring factor that characterizes my work is collaboration. I constantly work with other people. I couldn't do what I do by myself. And again, as I show you some of the work that I've done, you'll see why. But yeah, so in recent years, I've been fortunate enough to work with anti-fascist protesters, DJs, dancers, sheet metal workers, musicians, young people with learning difficulties, geologists, and members of my own family. So for a forthcoming project, I'm actually hoping to bring together a group of Quakers in order to form a punk band. I'll let you know how that goes. My work asks questions of the world that we live in. It's frequently about affecting change and acting to affect that change. It doesn't shy away from the social, political, economic, or environmental conditions that shape our lives. It actively speaks of and interrogates them. So when I look back at the various projects that I've undertaken over the past 5 to 6 years, it's impossible not to think that the approach that I have to making art has something, if not everything, to do with being a Quaker. I approach art making as an act of witness, attempting to make contributions to culture that are deeply connected to my Quaker values. Growing up, skateboarding was actually a hugely significant part of my life, and I like to joke that I can navigate the country via skate parks. In a similar manner, young Quaker events are the grammar and punctuation that makes sense of my passage through time. They turn it into sophisticated and meaningful sentences. These sentences are writ large across my very being. In no other sphere of my life have I encountered a community that has gifted me with so many close friendships and dear memories. Alongside the social aspects of these young Quaker events, they also brought me into contact with an incredible array of people and ideas. I'm certain that many young Quakers will remember Helen Stephen when she came and spoke to us as part of the Young People's Programme at York in 2005. I will never forget her lucid account of kayaking out to the Trident nuclear submarines, secretly boarding one, planting potatoes, and trying to do a runner in the same kayak. It's incredibly memorable, not to mention a surreal image. The non-violent direct action undertaken by Quakers and other activists is frequently coloured by a similar subversive, playful, and humorous lens. There's a special place in my heart for the elderly Quakers who have made a habit of crossing the road in a painfully slow manner so as to prevent missiles and tanks being delivered to the Desi Arms Fair. It's only in retrospect that I can understand the significance of experiences and moments like the ones that I describe with regard to shaping the work that I do now. I'm indebted to the innumerable Quakers who've put their faith into action, inspiring myself and others to do the same. So I'd like to share a brief account of my first Quaker Vigil for Peace, which I originally wrote for the 2018 Quaker calendar. So I was attending summer gathering up in Stirling with my mum and my brother, and we'd opted to go to a protest rather than go swimming. And I'm pretty sure it would have been my first. It's summer, but I am incredibly cold. It is Scotland, after all. I've been sat here in silence for about half an hour, motionless. I'm probably about half my age now. I've been wearing a baseball cap all week because I tried to cut my own hair and ended up creating a small bald patch. It embarrasses me horribly. A truck rumbles into view. We remain silent, enacting our testimony to peace with bodies and minds, separate yet unified. Security checks are carried out. Barriers are raised, and the truck enters the compound. The cold has now reached my fingers, my toes, and the tip of my nose, which doesn't normally feel anything. Meeting for worship always makes me feel deeply aware of my body and its connections to the bodies of others. People around me are singing about bridges, about reaching, about harmony. I join in, lending my voice. We sing, enacting our testimony to peace with bodies and minds, separate yet unified. Some memories are difficult to recall. Others permeate your very being. I don't think the memory of my first Quaker vigil for peace outside of Faslane Nuclear Base will ever fade. I'll never forget singing about bridges, about reaching, about harmony, as I poked my fingers through the chain-link fence. We held witness for peace at the side of a back road, as trucks came and went, and men cradled automatic weapons. We remained silent, enacting our testimony to peace with bodies and minds, separate yet unified. I continue to attend Young Quaker events as a volunteer, attempting to pay forward some of the gifts that I received from this glowing Quaker community. Each year, I look forward to being inspired by the incredible young people that we host. I don't look forward to putting them to bed. So now that I've given you a kind of brief overview of some of the ideas and approaches that inform my work, I'd like to get into what I make and what I make happen. So I'm going to start with a biggie. So in 2012, when I was studying for my BA in Fine Art, I began a project that would go on to significantly shape everything that I've done since, and probably it will continue to kind of shape my approach to making art and just doing things in the world. So obviously I couldn't have known that at the time, and I largely bumbled my way through it, not quite knowing what I was doing, but doing my best to learn from my mistakes and keep it together. So this image, you can kind of see, it's a wall, someone has sprayed EDL in white, and someone's gone over it in pink, and it says English Disco Lovers. So that's the name of the project. The project is called English Disco Lovers, and it was a counter-English Defence League group which looked to reclaim the EDL acronym of the aforementioned Defence League, whilst reinvigorating the kind of utopian vision of disco music and deploying it in opposition to a contemporary incarnation of racism and fascism. Initially, the idea had taken root during a camping trip which I'd taken the previous summer with a group of close Quaker friends. One friend, Gerard Fife, had purchased a supermarket pop-up tent which he hoped was going to stand up to Dorset's coastal weather. Upon opening his purchase, he was dismayed to find that it came with a St. George's Cross flag. In true Gerard fashion, he whipped out a permanent marker and proceeded to deface it with a large and somewhat wonky EDL. I simultaneously laughed at his audacity and expressed my alarm. He then changed it so it read English Disco Lovers. I may have also added a disco ball, you know. Got to make sure your subversive messaging is clear. So Gerard's pop-up tent very quickly proved to be insufficient against horizontal wind and rain. And I found myself sharing my tent with Gerard and the defaced flag. And we, so as teenagers, Gerard and I had attended many Young Quaker events together. We'd spent a lot of time writing songs together, many of which would be about the staff who were taking care of us at these events. Highlights include the Simon Best song and its sequel, The Best Beard. And I have a sneaking suspicion that those songs may well be why I'm standing here today. Not because the titular Simon Best is head of learning at Woodbrooke, but because writing songs with Gerard and being in this kind of creative, accepting, fun environment with other young Quakers, it was the kind of crucible in which I began to forge a sense of creativity. But I digress. To cut a story of near endless meanders short, Gerard and I continue to joke about this hypothetical group, the English disco lovers. I began to try and form a visual identity for them, scribbling potential logos in which I subverted the heraldry so often used by the English Defence League. So I began with a logo. I swapped out a shield for a disco ball, a cross for a dancer. Their Latin motto was replaced with Unus Mundus and again Unus Disco. It may be clear that I've never had a single Latin lesson in my life and relied entirely on Google Translate. So I was going for one world, one race, one disco, a riff on Bob Marley's one world, one race, one people. And it has since actually been pointed out to me by a kind of theorist and artist called Hito Steil that if you were to try and translate disco from Latin into English, you end up with something along the lines of I learn to know, or I become acquainted with. It's a happy kind of linguistic accident that hints at and encourages the making of a turn, the broadening of one's horizons, a perspective-enhancing gesture, which takes the unfamiliar warmly by the hand. So I encourage you all to disco. I think you might like it. So in subverting the visual identity of the English Defence League, it became apparent to me that they were kind of using heraldry as a way to sort of historicise themselves, to naturalise their ideology. Posting pictures of crusading knights to their Facebook page was kind of a mode of self-actualisation, which involved plotting a line through history. They naturalised their claim to power by extrapolating in reverse. And throughout my work, I've tried to destabilise or subvert some of this kind of the logic of that kind of behaviour. The late cultural theorist Mark Fisher said, "Emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable." And as I discuss my work further, I hope that my interest in what Fisher describes becomes more apparent. So when I returned to university, entered my second year of study, at this point I've denounced painting, I began to consider the possibility of developing English disco lovers from idea in a Dorset tent through to actuality. What if this group actually existed, I asked myself. What might that look like and what might happen? So in the early days, English Disco Lovers was a Facebook page, soon followed by a Twitter profile. I shared images captioned with rhyming slogans, known online as memes. And I was told I should probably define what a meme is for many of those present. So I'm looking at the teenagers. So Wikipedia defines a meme as an idea or behavior or style that spreads from person to person within a culture, often with the aim of conveying a particular phenomena, theme, or meaning represented by the meme. They also tend to be quite funny. It's like a humorous mode of communication via images. I'll just show you some examples. Fewer xenophobes, more disco strobes. Don't hide your faces any longer. Come and join the disco conga. People to hate, people to blame, under the mirror ball, we're all the same. So people would share these memes with their friends, spreading the idea of English disco lovers across social media, gradually growing the project's online presence and forming a loose community that grew up around English disco lovers. I had a kind of set of goals in mind and set these out in a sort of manifesto that I like to refer to as the disco statement. So the key objectives were to become the top EDL, if you searched for those letters on Google, to become the top EDL on Facebook and Twitter in terms of likes and followers, and to make the EDL acronym more synonymous with disco than so-called defence. And for several months, English disco lovers grew steadily. It was honed in conversation with this small kind of online community that had formed around it. I had a lot of conversations with the people who were in many ways sort of adopting this as something that they felt an affinity for. And before I say more, I'd actually like to go off on a small tangent, because there are a number of key ideas that run through English disco lovers that I'd like to share with you. And I must admit that I am a bit of a glutton for research and etymology. And my projects are built atop these webs of association, and I'd like to unpick a segment for you. So in short, this is a diagram which helps me think about and rationalize where English disco lovers is sort of cited historically. During World War II, the Nazis occupied Paris. They deemed jazz to be degenerate for its associations with black and Jewish people. Parisian jazz clubs went underground as an act of defiance, and these clubs had to rely on recordings. Live music was deemed to be too risky, and these record libraries, as they came to be known, became these sites of anti-fascist resistance. And in French, record library is discothèque. So when conceptualizing English disco lovers, I looked to these discotheques as the kind of origin of that word. That thread of disco as a site of resistance runs through to the discotheques of 1970s America, which were havens for marginalized people. The lyrics of the genre emerged from these margins, emphasizing love, community, and togetherness. Pioneers of disco, such as Nile Rodgers, would frequently include veiled political messages in their songs. Unfortunately, disco was also a target, a scapegoat for racism and homophobia. On July 2nd, 1979, a Chicago radio DJ called Steve Dahl organized a rally. It was called Disco Demolition Night, and it's a famous instance of anti-disco sentiment fueled by underlying and at times explicit racism and homophobia. So the event was held during the halftime period of a baseball match in Chicago. And at halftime, Dahl comes out onto the playing field dressed in army fatigues, does a lap of honor in a Jeep. And by this point, they've been collecting records in from the crowd. And they've put them all in this massive crate, which is in the middle. And before detonating the crate, which is what had kind of been advertised, he bellows into the microphone. This is now the world's largest anti-disco rally. Now listen. We took all the disco records you brought tonight. We've got them in a giant box and we're going to blow them up real good. And then in an action that could be likened to Nazi book burning, Dahl ignited the fuse. After the explosion, thousands of people rushed the field, tore apart the batting cage, and built a bonfire in the center. Writing about Disco Demolition Night, Rolling Stone journalist Dave Marsh observed that white males, 18 to 34, are most likely to see disco as the product of homosexuals, blacks, and Latinos, and therefore they're most likely to respond to appeals to wipe out such so-called threats to their security. So English disco lovers is tied to these histories, but it's also inflected with my own Quaker upbringing. particularly my belief in effecting change via non-violent means. George Fox famously declared that he would not fight with outward weapons, saying, "Our weapons are spiritual and not carnal, yet mighty with God." As Quakers, we fight with weapons of the spirit: love, non-violence, humour, laughter, and in the case of English disco lovers, dancing in the streets. Yes, so having begun online, English disco lovers went from social media platforms, website, that kind of thing, to people self-organising to turn up at English Defence League demonstrations, blasting music, singing, dancing, bedecked in fancy disco gear. And they would, instead of chanting at the English Defence League like fascist scum or something like that, they would sing Gloria Gaynor. They would sing, "Now on, now go, walk out the door, turn around now, because you're not welcome anymore." How bizarre is that? Honestly. But no, people would get together in Exeter, Brighton, Bristol, Newcastle, Tower Hamlets, Westminster, and Birmingham, to name a few. And I very much see English disco lovers as an expression of a sort of defiant joy, like a defiant love. In the words of Fred Moten, the only way to protect joy is by practicing it. So the group continues to grow, and within a year of its initial inception, it had become the top EDL on Google. And it had accrued tens of thousands of followers across different social media platforms. And we'd also begun to organise loads and loads of kind of events, club nights, people kind of going out and that sort of thing. And not only did these open up the project to people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves as involved in activism or interested in protesting, it allowed us to start raising money for various charities. And one such charity began to emerge out of the sort of Brighton group of English disco lovers. So when the European refugee crisis began in 2015, this group of Brighton English disco lovers began a project called the Hummingbird Project, and they were providing aid, support in Calais and Dunkirk, and after the forced dismantling of the so-called jungle, they've continued to work lobbying our government for the rights of refugees to be upheld. And kind of looking back on this project, I'm surprised I had the gall, the kind of sheer cheek to do what I did. Throughout the project, particularly during 2013, I received a near constant stream of threats of violence towards myself and those close to me. At one point, I think I was maybe receiving between 4 and 5 threats of death a week. Unfortunately, these vile emails have stopped. As Quakers, we believe in that of God in everyone. So how do I reconcile this belief with daily torrents of abuse? It's not easy. I try to remember that the people involved with the English Defence League are not inherently evil. They are not inherently bad people. Their beliefs, whilst heinous, are a product of our society. For several years, up until early 2014, the English Defence League were one of the most visible and violent symptoms of white privilege, institutional racism, and post-colonial nationalism, as well as entrenched inequality. Their Islamophobia and racism is abhorrent, and the threat that they pose to Muslims and people of colour cannot be tolerated. However, they are minor players when it comes to maintaining that ideological status quo. The major players occupy positions of great power and influence within politics, culture, and the media. This is a grave problem. It is a festering wound, and it runs deep. And Quakers need to be part of the solution. There is a huge amount of amazing Quaker work being undertaken. but we do need to use our privilege and influence to dismantle the systems that perpetuate conditions which embolden groups like the English Defence League. It is vital that we stand in solidarity with people of colour, Muslims, refugees, and other minorities targeted and denigrated not only by groups like the English Defence League, but Theresa May and our own government. We must also look inwards. We've come of age in a systemically racist world, both as individuals and as an organisation. Many of us have benefited from the entrenched inequalities that run throughout our society. And we'd be complacent to think that these factors haven't left their mark, affecting our attitudes towards others. It is our duty as Quakers not only to acknowledge our own privilege and power, but to use them to actively address these society-wide issues. It's often said that Quakers speak truth to power. Sometimes we are the power to which truth must be spoken. So when I graduated from my BA, I did as many university graduates do. I moved back in with my parents. I actually moved in with my grandparents, but it's a variation on a theme. It's incredibly common for young people who are leaving university to find themselves moving in with a family member. And regardless of whether someone went to university or not, the numbers of young people who are living at home has reached a record high. Whilst I was unable to find affordable accommodation, I was able to find a job that had the passing resemblance of being connected to my area of study. Very good for the university statistics. So it was that I found myself working as a member of front of house for 2 London-based arts organisations. Unfortunately, neither of them offered any semblance of a permanent contract. Fixed-term, 0-hours contracts were the norm, meaning that the number of shifts that I got fluctuated quite dramatically from week to week, and the possibility of being let go at the end of one of these fixed-term contracts, which only ever lasted 3 to 4 months, kind of loomed permanently. And this emphasised how disposable and replaceable we were considered to be. They very gradually eroded one's sense of self-worth. In order to secure shifts, you were kind of constantly in this position of trying to outperform other people, just so you could pay your bills, pay your rent. And this state of constant competition, it has incredibly adverse effects. Within the workplace, it makes it much, much harder for employees to engage in effective collective negotiation with their employer, because the workforce is fragmented by internal frictions and that kind of myth of survival of the fittest. Those who agitate to have better working conditions, regular hours, sick pay, or, heavens, holiday, simply won't have their contracts renewed. To further isolate members of staff, a manager even went as far as preventing couples within the front of house team from working in the same building, which was one of the many attempts to kind of make us pliant and yielding. And these conditions are reproduced throughout the contemporary world of work, and they're becoming the norm, if not already. And whilst the implementers of such contracts will harp on about the benefits of flexible work, and our government will use 0-hours contracts to warp employment statistics, this state of seemingly endless precarity, instability, and competition is hugely detrimental. Such conditions undercut the inherent worth of each and every human being, reducing us to endlessly replaceable vessels of labour. Such treatment is a flattening out of the complex and nuanced reality of what it is to be human, a defacement of the collective soul. My experience of precarious work was a walk in the park compared to the conditions that some people face, though I still found it incredibly detrimental to my mental health. Precarious work and living situations are contributors to a much wider mental health crisis. Whilst I'm no scholar in this field and can only speak from personal experience, I believe that there are numerous other factors that are exacerbating said crisis. I think it's very much a crisis of kind of collective well-being and community. which in turn is a symptom of the kind of broader capitalist conditions that we live under. There's more emphasis on material wealth, the extrinsic over the intrinsic. And we're increasingly atomized at work, at home, when even ironically when communicating with others. An ongoing question that we face as friends is, how do we foster a community that's more attractive to and more inclusive of young people? And steps are being taken to implement these urgent and necessary changes. The fact that I'm standing here today is a good indicator of this religious society's desire to effect change within itself. And again, I can only speak from personal experience. But my experience of being a young Quaker probably overlaps with much of that of others. So I'd like to share with you some of my barriers that I and many others probably face when it comes to engaging fully with Quakerism. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, I've never formally entered into membership. I very much think that we need to rethink the way that we do membership, because at the moment it only really works for those who have a solid geographical base. Over the past 6 to 7 years, I've lived at 11 or 12 different addresses, and it makes it incredibly difficult to form a lasting relationship with a meeting and feel as though I want to become a member of said meeting. I love Quakerism. I love this religious society of friends, and when I can, I make time to volunteer at Young Quaker events or to attend meetings either locally or when I'm traveling as part of my work. But I do think we need quite a dramatic rethink, and it needs to take into account the fact that young people are increasingly precarious, are increasingly mobile, and that's maybe just a thought to put out there. So having grown up skateboarding, I have an accentuated appreciation for the more mundane and functional aspects of civic architecture. Throughout my teenage years, my brother and I would scout out and become disproportionately excited by sets of stairs, sloping banks, and other instances of skatable terrain. Honestly, I can only begin to describe to you the joy that we experienced thanks to angular bits of concrete. A bench would no longer be for sitting at a stretch lying down. It would be the site of endless combinations of tricks and dynamic creativity. On a daily basis, we would rewrite the accepted behaviors prescribed by our built environment, with our minds whirring, churning away with new ways to interact with these concrete slabs. Skateboarding and Quakerism are the twin pillars that uphold the roof of my art practice. And it's my love of skateboarding that brings me to kind of my next project. So in recent years, there have been various scandals around so-called aggressive architecture. Such architectural interventions include spikes in doorways where a homeless person might lie down, or an armrest across the middle of a bench where, again, you might want to lie down as opposed to sitting down. And this is perhaps the superlative of aggressive architecture. It's something called the Camden Bench, named after the borough that commissioned it, and it's a particularly insidious piece of design. It's supposed to prevent so-called antisocial behaviors. We're talking like rough sleeping, graffiti, skateboarding, spending too much time in the public realm without buying anything. So yeah, this is for me the epitome of aggressive architecture. So what I wanted to do was take this thing, which was designed primarily to not be for things. It's like the perfect anti-object. I I wanted to take this and make something that was specifically for that bench. So I made a game. So it's called A Shared Interest in the Bounce. And it's essentially ping pong, and players are invited to play ping pong on the surface of this very angular bench, but instead of competing against each other, they kind of compete against the bench. So you've got to have the longest rally possible, but the slippery angular surface makes it incredibly difficult. But the whole idea with the project was to draw attention to this thing that kind of goes unseen. It sort of slumps there, this concrete slug. And you only really notice how bad it is as a bench when you sit down, it's cold, it's slippery. When we were doing this, there were quite a few pubs where these ones are in kind of Covent Garden area. A guy came over and he sat down on one of them, took a phone call, put down his pint. Yeah. So yeah, aggressive architecture, it's designed to deflect antisocial behavior elsewhere. It doesn't ameliorate, it doesn't compromise, it doesn't solve. And it does it in these often quite covert, subtle, unspoken ways. But when you're the one designed against, you do notice it, and it can breed resentment. In the words of the writer Alexandriou, by making the city less accepting of the human frame, we make it less welcoming to all humans. By making our environment more hostile, we become more hostile with it. I've noticed we actually have our own bevy of handles and skate stoppers in the Friend's House garden, which I'm not hugely fond of, because Quakers do such excellent work with regard to combating homelessness, supporting the homeless. And I am concerned by what that kind of says visually. I feel as though we undercut what we do when we end up installing knobs and armrests. It subtly undermines our values and all that good work that's being undertaken. And we can't let our standards slip in our own back garden. So much of what I do is self-initiated. It comes from some kind of body of research, a sense of interest, a sense that the work that I previously made had some problems that needed addressing. So, but sometimes people ask me to do things, and I was recently asked by a kind of art gallery in Cardiff if I would make a billboard for them. And I quite liked the idea of doing a billboard. And I'd been thinking quite a lot about the Bristol Channel, and I'd been thinking about the 1607 flood of the Bristol Channel. And I'd also been thinking about something slightly newer. That would be Hinkley Point C, the nuclear power station being built on the southern bank of the Channel. And I began to think, okay, so what if this flood were to happen again? And so this is a woodcut from the front of a kind of 1600s pamphlet that told the story of this flood. And I thought, okay, what if I made a new one? What if I made one with Hinkley Point C in the middle? The science fiction writer J.G. Ballard, there's this quote from him where he says how he always thought that people living in the cozy suburbia of Western Europe and America never appreciated just how vulnerable we are to climate change. And we are cozy, especially compared to the global south, which is disproportionately affected by climate change and climate disasters. So I saw this as maybe a 6 by 3 meter omen or early warning system. So in my version, the central church has been replaced by Hinkley Point C as it undergoes a flood-induced meltdown. And that small gesture of replacing one building for another is a kind of comment about where belief may reside. And we would be foolish to put our belief in Hinkley Point C, wouldn't we? There's recent research that suggests that renewable energy is being, in many ways, made more difficult to invest in and therefore produce by our government's utter obsession with the Trident nuclear weapons. And Hinkley is part of that nuclear infrastructure that is being kept in this country for, frankly, ridiculous reasons. The absurdity of Hinkley is near irrefutable. Once complete, it will be the most expensive power station in the world. And whilst the production of nuclear energy doesn't contribute to carbon emissions, like I've said, its existence is pushing up the price of making renewable energy viable. So a willingness to acknowledge the flaws in one's work is a key part of being an artist. So the reason I kind of showed you that one was I do think about the issues with it. I can call it an omen. I can call it an early warning. But you'd have probably sensed a bit of reluctance from me when I was talking about that one, because what sort of worries me is this idea of creating these essentially images of the apocalypse. It makes it seem untacklable, unapproachable, scary, preordained. And I do think a lot about that. And the project that I'd like to talk about next is maybe me attempting to address some of the problems that I saw in that project. So there's this really beautiful essay called The White Bird, which is by a kind of artist and theorist called John Berger, in which he writes that art proclaims man in hope of receiving a surer reply. And I originally read that text in 2013, and it's something that's really stayed with me, that idea of someone kind of like shouting into nothingness, into a sort of abyss, and then straining to hear some kind of response. So for Berger, making art is kind of about this attempt to maybe kind of better know the world, to better know ourselves. It's about grappling with what it is to live and what it is to live now without the promise of definite answers. And we're all dealing with the uncertain, the unknowable. And art is one of the many, many responses that humans have to that unknown. Another might be attending Quaker meeting. In the face of the unknown, the abyss, the thing that you yell into and hope for a response, we reach out. We reach out to others who, like us, don't know. And we weave a web of love and friendship and kindness, a network of meaning that makes us feel less like we're on a tiny rock flying through space, and more like we're holding hands with those we care for and who care for us. We have faith that there is something beyond our immediate perception, and sometimes we glimpse it when we gather. So when thinking about the flaws with that billboard project, I decided coming out of it that I would make a currency that continually depreciates in value. A joke, but I am serious. I've been thinking about the recent phenomena of Bitcoin, and I'm not going to go into the intricacies of how Bitcoin works, because it's really quite complex and I don't quite understand it. But what I do know is that if the production of this cryptocurrency were to be kind of grouped together and considered as a country, the production of Bitcoin would be the same as the Republic of Ireland per annum in terms of energy consumption. So Bitcoin is basically predicated on this accelerated consumption of energy. And I was thinking about a quote from a Quaker economist called Kenneth E. Boulding, who once said that anyone who believes in indefinite growth of anything physical on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. Global economies are kind of founded on this principle of perpetual growth, and left unchecked, our fixation with resource consumption will devastate our planet. It seems perverse that the well-being of a country is measured in GDP, gross domestic product. If this number ceases to increase, or horror of horrors starts to decrease, it's considered to be a total disaster. We're so infatuated with growth that a decrease in GDP is described as negative growth. Whilst running for re-election and in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, Barack Obama even remarked that we're not going to ignore jobs and growth simply to address climate change. It seems utterly bizarre that growth and the creation of jobs should be prioritized over the annihilation of our planet, short-term over long-term. So I figured that developing a currency that implicates such economic practices in the ongoing process of climate change might be a good idea, some kind of self-checking system. Or at the very least, it's an interesting thought experiment. So until the 1930s, well, 1931, the UK used the gold standard, a kind of monetary system where the value of a country's currency is directly linked to gold. So what if the value of a currency was directly linked to an indicator of climate change? Such indicators include Arctic sea ice, sea levels, and atmospheric carbon. By now, you're probably aware that I'm not an economist, but I do plan to seek out more expert advice when I attempt to establish a working model for this currency. Okay, so to create a currency linked to indicators of climate change. So you produce a kind of feedback loop that intrinsically links the currency to said indicator. And if the currency is directly linked to atmospheric carbon, this feedback loop would cause the currency to depreciate in value if the amount of atmospheric carbon increased. This model may well be far too simple, and it's perhaps necessary to devise something that's a little more complex to make it work. But like I say, an interesting thought experiment. Either way, I hope to create a currency that can discourage investment in that which would exacerbate climate change, such as fracking and offshore drilling, and encourages investment in that which encourages investment in that which would slow or halt climate change, so solar energy and wind farms, for instance. Unfortunately, for anyone actually choosing to purchase this currency, it's likely to continually depreciate in value unless we get our act in gear. Although all currencies would be utterly pointless in a resource-scarce world wrought by climate change. You may well think that some of the projects that I have described to you are absurd. However, I think that we should spend more time investigating such absurdities. Whilst a currency that constantly depreciates in value may seem ridiculous, a currency that plays a part in curtailing climate change would be miraculous. The absurd is defined by the dominant logic of our time, and that dominant logic has kind of led us to a dead end, although it does insist we forge ahead. To be absurd is to go against or think outside of this flawed, dead-end logic, which tries to present itself as the natural way, the way things must be, and the only way, the way things will forever be. In many ways, being an artist grants me license to pursue that which might otherwise be deemed pointless or impossible. When I founded English Disco Lovers, my tutors were not only puzzled, but actively discouraged me from pursuing the project. However, the pursuit of ideas that sit outside of the norm, or even go against it, are vital. Without new ideas that defy said norm, We are locked into modes of thought that have failed us, and will fail to create a better world from we will fail to create a better world from such poor resources. I think of my work as exercises in imagining otherwise, the world otherwise, ourselves otherwise, and acting to make that seemingly distant otherwise more possible and bring it closer to hand. So these are my tools, and I offer them to you. May we go forth and reshape the world. May our exploits be worthy of the first blockbuster film which tells of a civilization that averted climate change. A people who dismantled entrenched social inequalities of class, race, gender, sexuality, and more. A people who learnt to live in peace with the needs of all catered for within the limits of our planet. Let it tell a story, not of heroes, but of communities that forged our world anew. We must imagine this future, for if we cannot imagine it, we cannot speak it into existence. Thank you.